The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the prestigious Alverstone Gallery, casting a soft glow on the polished marble floors. The gallery was known for housing the most expensive and rare pieces of art in the world. Its walls adorned with classic masterpieces, sculptures from every corner of the globe, and abstract creations that only the most discerning of collectors could understand. It was a place where names were made and forgotten, where the elite gathered to see and be seen. Among those who frequented Alverstone was Richard Alverstone himself, the owner of the gallery. A man in his late 50s, with a sharp suit, meticulously combed silver hair, and a gaze that could freeze someone in their tracks, Richard had built an empire on the backs of artists he deemed worthy. He was a man of taste, style, and a reputation for spotting art that was marketable. But there was one thing that Richard did not have, and that was an appreciation for anything that deviated from his own narrow view of art. On that particular morning, Richard was walking through the gallery with his usual air of superiority. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble as he made his way to a private viewing room where he was scheduled to meet with an artist he had been hearing whispers about. The artist's name was Elijah Washington. Elijah was a young black artist, not widely known in the art world, but someone whose work had begun to gain attention in underground circles. His pieces were bold and unrelenting, depicting a fusion of African heritage and futuristic themes. The world he painted was one where past and future collided, vibrant, colorful, and chaotic. It was raw, unapologetic, and often unsettling. But Elijah had something that Richard couldn't see, a vision. When Elijah entered the gallery, dressed casually in a black hoodie and jeans, the difference in their worlds was immediately apparent. Richard, in his perfectly tailored suit, raised an eyebrow as Elijah approached, almost as though he were inspecting a piece of furniture rather than an artist. Elijah extended his hand, but Richard barely acknowledged it, instead nodding curtly as he gestured for Elijah to sit down. "So, Elijah," Richard said, with a slight sneer in his voice, "I've heard about your work. It's unconventional, to say the least." Elijah sat down, meeting Richard's cold gaze with his own. He'd been rejected by galleries before, and he knew the drill. Art critics and gallery owners often dismissed his work because they didn't understand it. It wasn't clean, it wasn't perfect, and it didn't fit into their neatly packaged world of high society art. "I know it's different," Elijah said, his voice calm, "but I believe it speaks to something deeper. It's a reflection of where we've been and where we could go." Richard chuckled, his eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and condescension. "Yes, well, that's all well and good, but in the art world, we value things that speak to sophistication. Things that can be sold at auction for millions. Your work, well, it lacks that. It's almost chaotic. Unrefined." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. He had heard it all before, but hearing it from someone who held so much power in the art world felt different. It felt like rejection, not just of his art, but of everything he stood for. "I've sold paintings in underground shows that have sold for tens of thousands of dollars," Elijah said, his voice steady but with an edge. "It's not about refinement, it's about the message." Richard raised a hand, cutting him off. "I'm sure it has a message, but that doesn't change the fact that it's not the kind of thing that will make collectors flock to it. We need something that has more appeal. Something that fits into the space we've cultivated here. Your work would never attract the kind of buyers we cater to." Elijah sat back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He could feel the weight of the words, but he wasn't going to let Richard see how much they stung. He had worked too hard for this moment. He had poured his soul into every canvas, every stroke of paint, every design. He wasn't just painting for the sake of painting, he was telling a story. "I understand," Elijah said, his voice tinged with a quiet resolve. "But my art isn't about fitting into your space. It's about creating a new space." Richard scoffed, the sound echoing off the gallery walls. "A new space?" he repeated. "That's cute, Elijah, but art is about more than just vision. It's about creating something that people want to buy. What you're doing isn't even worth hanging in a space like this." Elijah felt the sting of the words, but he refused to back down. He had been underestimated his whole life. People had called him unrefined, untalented, too different. But now, standing before Richard Alverstone, he realized he had something that could shake the very foundation of the art world. The world was changing, and it wasn't going to wait for people like Richard to catch up. "I appreciate you taking the time to see my work, but I think we're done here," Elijah said, standing up. Richard looked up, surprised by the artist's sudden departure. "Done? You're not even going to let me make an offer?" Elijah smiled faintly, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "No, I'm not." With that, Elijah turned and walked out of the gallery, leaving Richard sitting alone in the room, fuming in confusion. He had never been treated with such indifference, and for a moment, he thought he might have misjudged Elijah. But then he shook his head, dismissing the thought. After all, who was this artist, really? Just another young, unrefined black man with grand ideas and no marketability. As Elijah walked out onto the bustling streets, he couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet triumph. He wasn't going to let someone like Richard define his worth. His art had something bigger to say, and one day, the world would hear it. But for now, he had to keep pushing forward, one brushstroke at a time. Little did Richard know, the world of art was about to change forever. Weeks passed, and the art world moved on, as it always did. Richard Alverstone continued to make his rounds, securing more conventional works, selling paintings to high-profile collectors who cared more about status than substance. His gallery flourished, but the cracks in his understanding of the art world were beginning to widen. He didn't know it yet, but the artist he had dismissed, Elijah Washington, was about to shatter everything Richard thought he knew about art. Elijah, on the other hand, had taken Richard's words and used them as fuel. He was relentless. He poured himself into his work, ignoring the setbacks and the critiques that had come before. The rejection from Alverstone Gallery had stung, but it had also pushed him further into his craft. He locked himself in his studio for days at a time, the walls of his apartment covered in splashes of paint, patterns, and images of his ancestors, blending the past and future into a vision that was uniquely his own. One night, after weeks of isolation, Elijah completed what he knew would be his greatest work yet. He stepped back from the massive canvas, admiring the surreal, yet harmonious chaos he had created. The piece was titled Futures Unbound, a striking portrayal of humanity's journey through the centuries, its triumphs and failures, its wars and victories, all interwoven with elements of African symbolism and speculative technology. The painting was a statement, a story of humanity's past and its potential future, wrapped in vivid hues and geometric designs that vibrated with energy. Elijah had never felt such a deep connection to a piece before. His hands, still stained with paint, trembled as he gazed at the work. It wasn't just a painting, it was a testament to everything he had endured and everything he hoped for. The fluid strokes of the background echoed the struggles of his people, while the sharp, angular lines in the foreground symbolized the cutting-edge technology that humanity could one day harness. It was bold. It was daring. It was revolutionary. But it was also dangerous. The art world, as Elijah knew, wasn't ready for this level of disruption. Yet, he knew it had to be seen. The piece would either be accepted as a new frontier in art, or it would be rejected entirely. He couldn't take it back now, and he wouldn't. He reached out to a few trusted contacts in the underground art scene, those who understood the vision, who weren't blinded by the conventional, and who might be willing to help him get his work into the right hands. The underground auction circuit was where the real art lovers gathered, those who could see beyond the surface, those who understood the heart of what a piece represented. And so, Elijah's masterpiece was sold in private, far away from the prying eyes of traditional galleries like Alverstone's. It was purchased by a mysterious art collector who, for reasons unknown, was willing to pay an eye-watering sum for the piece. The collector, a powerful and enigmatic figure in the art world, had heard whispers of futures unbound through his own channels. He knew it was a game-changer. The art world had underestimated Elijah, but he saw the potential of what this young artist was doing. His decision to buy the piece was a calculated one. He understood the revolution that was unfolding before his eyes. The news of Elijah's painting selling for millions quickly spread like wildfire, causing a stir in the art community. Art critics, collectors, and investors were all left scrambling to understand how they had missed such a monumental work. For weeks, Futures Unbound dominated conversations at high-end galleries, auction houses, and art forums across the globe. People who had once ignored Elijah's work began to see it through new eyes. Was he a genius? A visionary? Or just another artist who had somehow gotten lucky? One thing was certain, Elijah Washington was no longer an unknown. As for Richard Alverstone, he had no idea what was happening in the world outside of his own. He was preoccupied with another exhibition, focusing on a new collection of abstract paintings by an artist whose work he deemed safe. He continued his usual routine, his life filled with the shallow transactions of a world that valued the polished over the raw, the familiar over the innovative. But when the news of Elijah's monumental sale reached his ears, it felt like a slap in the face. It came to him through his assistant, Carla, who burst into his office with a look of excitement. "Richard, you won't believe this," she exclaimed, holding up her phone. "Elijah Washington's painting Futures Unbound sold for over $30 million at auction." Richard's eyes narrowed. "What? Elijah Washington?" He scowled, a name he had barely remembered from their brief meeting. That kid?" "Yes, that kid," Carla replied, scrolling through her phone. "The underground auction just went public, and it's causing a frenzy. The art world can't stop talking about it. They say it's a turning point for contemporary art." Richard's mind raced. $30 million? For a painting he had dismissed so easily? The very same artist whose work he had called chaotic and unrefined? It didn't make sense. This was the kind of thing that could ruin reputations in an instant, especially for someone like him, who had built his career on the idea of having impeccable taste and understanding. The humiliation hit him like a wave. For years, he had prided himself on knowing what was valuable, what would sell. But he had missed it. He had missed the next big thing. And now, the very artist he had mocked was being celebrated by the world. It didn't sit well with him. Richard had never been one to admit he was wrong, but this was different. This was more than just a mistake, it was a challenge to his entire worldview. "Elijah Washington," Richard muttered under his breath, his face growing darker. "I'll need to meet him again." The months that followed were a whirlwind for Elijah Washington. The sale of Futures Unbound had turned him from a relatively unknown artist into a global sensation. Art critics who had previously dismissed his work now hailed him as a visionary. Auction houses clamored to represent him, and collectors who had once ignored his underground shows now lined up to acquire his next masterpiece. Elijah had known this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it to arrive so suddenly, or with such force. His phone rang constantly, with calls from galleries and collectors, each offering a different deal, a different promise. Some offered vast sums of money for exclusive rights to his work. Others wanted to collaborate on exhibitions or feature him in high-profile art festivals. It was overwhelming, and Elijah often found himself questioning whether it was all real. But despite the glitz and glamour of his newfound fame, Elijah remained grounded. He was no longer the young artist scraping by in small underground shows. He was now a force in the art world, but he had not forgotten his roots. His art continued to reflect his heritage, his struggles, and the hopes of his community. The fame and fortune were fleeting, the message his art conveyed was eternal. Meanwhile, Richard Alverstone watched from the sidelines, stunned by the rapid rise of Elijah's career. The media buzz surrounding Futures Unbound was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was as if the entire art world had been struck by lightning. Critics were writing essays, analyzing every inch of the painting, trying to dissect the meaning behind its intricate designs and bold colors. Auction houses were scrambling to feature his work, and collectors were ready to pay a premium for anything with Elijah's signature. Richard couldn't ignore the impact Elijah was having on the art market. His gallery, once a top destination for collectors seeking the finest art, was now losing out to this young artist's meteoric rise. Richard had been in the business for decades, but he had never seen anything like this. The traditional art world, which he had spent his life cultivating, was being upended by a man he had once dismissed as nothing more than a rebellious outsider. One afternoon, Richard was walking through the gallery, his hands clasped behind his back, when Carla approached him, holding a piece of newsprint. "Richard, you need to see this," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. Richard took the paper from her, his eyes scanning the headline. It read, "Elijah Washington, the artist who's redefining the future of art." Beneath the headline was a photo of Elijah, standing proudly beside his latest painting, a futuristic cityscape infused with symbols from his African heritage. The caption read, "A new era of art is being ushered in by the revolutionary works of Elijah Washington, whose radical fusion of culture and technology is challenging the norms of contemporary art." Richard's jaw tightened as he read. The words stung. He had never seen a piece of art that had garnered this kind of cultural impact, this kind of reverence. It was no longer just about the money. Elijah's work was now regarded as a cultural landmark, something that transcended galleries, auctions, and collectors. It was a symbol of change, a reflection of a world that was rapidly evolving, and it resonated with people from all walks of life. As the article detailed the unprecedented success of Elijah's career, Richard's frustration grew. He had missed the boat. He had been so focused on curating what he thought was art that he had failed to see the revolution happening right before his eyes. Richard knew something had to be done. He needed to get in on this, to at least be associated with the movement Elijah had started. He couldn't allow another gallery to be the sole benefactor of Elijah's talent. The thought of seeing one of his most significant competitors rise to global prominence was unbearable. He made a decision: he would try to bring Elijah back into the fold. Richard, in his mind, could offer the young artist something the underground world couldn't: stability, recognition, and a chance to reach the top of the art world. He would offer Elijah an exclusive contract, something no one else had done, something that would secure his place in the highest echelons of the art market. Richard wasted no time. He called his assistant and instructed her to arrange a meeting with Elijah. But this time, things would be different. This time, Richard would show respect. This time, he would acknowledge Elijah's genius and offer him something that no other gallery could. Elijah, however, was no fool. He had seen Richard's type before: arrogant, dismissive, and opportunistic. The last time he had walked into Alverstone Gallery, Richard had barely given him the time of day. Now, suddenly, he wanted to offer him a contract? It was clear to Elijah that Richard hadn't come to terms with what he had lost. The artist's success was not just a matter of talent, it was a cultural shift. The world was changing, and Richard was struggling to keep up. But Elijah had bigger things in mind. He had no interest in becoming just another cog in the machine of the art establishment. He wasn't about to sell out to the very system that had rejected him. What he was creating wasn't just art, it was a movement. And movements didn't thrive under the constraints of traditional galleries, they thrived in the streets, in the hearts of the people, and in spaces that welcomed new voices. The phone call came through while Elijah was in his studio, his fingers stained with the colors of his latest piece. Carla's voice was on the other end, cheerful, but with an underlying urgency. "Elijah, Richard Alverstone wants to meet with you. He's offering an exclusive deal to showcase your work. I think this is the big one." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Richard had finally realized the value of his work, but it was too late. "I'll think about it," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. But inside, he already knew what his decision would be. Richard Alverstone had underestimated him once. Now, it was time for him to understand that true art could never be bought or sold by the highest bidder. It was time for Elijah to take control of his destiny and pave his own path forward. The decision to decline Richard Alverstone's offer was not a simple one for Elijah. It wasn't just about rejecting the offer of a prestigious gallery. It was about something deeper, something far more significant than just a financial opportunity. Elijah knew the value of his art wasn't just in its price tag. It was in its message. The moment he'd turned down the offer, he understood that he had become something more than just an artist, he had become a symbol. Still, the weight of the choice lingered in the back of his mind as he moved forward with his work. As much as he believed in his vision, the art world was full of power players, and turning down an offer from Richard Alverstone, the very man who controlled the fate of so many artists, meant going against the establishment in a very public way. Despite his reservations, Elijah refused to compromise his values. He continued to create, his work evolving with every piece he produced. His latest painting, Tomorrow's Dreams, was a tribute to the unknown future, a vibrant portrayal of a world where technology and humanity worked in harmony, united by their shared experiences. It was bold and futuristic, but with threads of history woven into its very fabric. As the weeks passed, Elijah's reputation continued to grow. The underground art scene had embraced him, but now the mainstream was starting to take notice as well. His work was showing up in galleries across the world, and major auction houses were beginning to display his pieces, with prices soaring far beyond anyone's expectations. It was clear that Elijah wasn't just another artist, he was a movement. Then came the day that would forever change his trajectory. Elijah was working late in his studio when he received an unexpected email. It was from an anonymous sender, with no subject line, just a single sentence. "The world is ready for you, Elijah. The time has come." The cryptic message stirred something deep within him. It was as if the universe itself had spoken to him, urging him to take the next step. At first, he thought it was just a prank, a curious message sent by a fan or a critic. But something in the words felt like a calling. Something within him knew this was bigger than anything he had experienced so far. The message was followed by a link to a video. Intrigued, Elijah clicked the link, and a video started playing. It was a recording of a clandestine gathering of influential figures in the art world, all gathered in a darkened room. Some of the faces were familiar, critics, curators, and artists, but there were others whose identities Elijah couldn't place. In the center of the room stood a figure, a tall, imposing man dressed in black, with a voice that commanded authority. He spoke with passion, his words heavy with conviction. "The time has come," the man's voice echoed. "Elijah Washington's art has awakened something in all of us. His work transcends the boundaries of art and speaks to the future of humanity. It is a symbol of what we can become, of what we must strive for. We cannot afford to let this movement be confined to galleries and auctions. It must be shared with the world." The room erupted in applause, and Elijah's heart raced as he watched the video unfold. Was this some kind of secret society? Were these the powerful figures who had been watching his rise from the shadows? The man continued, his words filling the room with a sense of urgency. "We will take Elijah's vision and bring it to the masses. We will fund his work, support him, and make sure the world understands that his art is not just a reflection of the future, it is the future. We will help him become the cultural force he was always meant to be." As the video ended, Elijah was left in stunned silence. What had he just seen? Who were these people? And why were they so invested in his success? It was clear that this wasn't just about money or fame. They wanted to amplify his voice, to help him change the world. The message, both mysterious and powerful, left Elijah with a deep sense of responsibility. He had always known his work was different, but now it felt like the world was waiting for him to lead it into something new. This was more than art, it was a movement that would shape the future. The next few days were a blur of excitement and confusion. Elijah reached out to his closest allies in the art world, artists, curators, and critics who had supported him from the beginning, to see if they knew anything about the mysterious group behind the message. Some had heard rumors of a global initiative to promote new, disruptive art movements, but no one had concrete details. The secrecy surrounding it only made the situation more intense. At the same time, Richard Alverstone was dealing with his own turmoil. The art world had been changing rapidly, and his inability to adapt had begun to show. Despite his best efforts, his gallery's sales had dropped significantly, with collectors increasingly turning to more progressive artists like Elijah Washington. Richard had tried everything: new exhibitions, more traditional pieces, even investing in emerging artists, but the tide of the art world seemed to be moving away from him. Richard was no longer the kingmaker. The establishment he had built was crumbling, and he knew he had to do something drastic to regain his position of power. He called a meeting with his most trusted advisors. "We need Elijah," he said bluntly. "He is the face of the new art world, and we have to be a part of it. We can't afford to be left behind." The plan was simple: Richard would offer Elijah a deal too good to refuse. He would provide the full resources of his gallery, plus access to his extensive network of collectors, curators, and critics. In exchange, Elijah would sign an exclusive contract with Alverstone Gallery, ensuring that his future works would be showcased under the banner of the most prestigious gallery in the world. But this time, Richard wasn't going to dismiss Elijah's work as chaotic or unrefined. He knew that to win Elijah over, he had to embrace what made the artist's work revolutionary. Elijah, however, was no longer the young man seeking validation. He had become something far more important than the art world had ever anticipated: a cultural icon, a leader of a new generation. And as he stood on the precipice of what could be the biggest decision of his life, he knew that he had to choose the path that aligned with his vision, not just with the world's expectations. The turning point had arrived, and Elijah had one final choice to make. Elijah stood at the edge of his studio, gazing at the stark contrast between the two paths laid before him. On one side, Richard Alverstone's offer gleamed like a beacon of success, promising fame, wealth, and the establishment of his legacy within the halls of the world's most prestigious galleries. On the other, the mysterious video he'd watched, a plea from an anonymous global network that seemed to want something more. A movement. A revolution. To bring his art to the people, free from the constraints of the traditional art world. He had been working in isolation for so long, but now it seemed like the universe had collided with his passion, and the time had come to choose his future. For a while, Elijah tried to distance himself from the decision, thinking it would simply come to him in time. He kept his focus on the work, the paint, the stories. His latest pieces, City of Tomorrow and Heritage of the Stars, were unlike anything he had ever done. He was painting the future, blending technology, African traditions, and intergalactic exploration into one breathtaking fusion. It was his personal utopia, a vision of a world where humanity overcame its struggles and embraced the beauty of diversity, innovation, and unity. But as each day passed, the weight of the choice gnawed at him. Richard had a way of making his offer seem irresistible. His reputation preceded him, and many artists would have jumped at the chance to be a part of his gallery. But Elijah wasn't just another artist, he was a creator with a mission. His art wasn't about pleasing the elite, or conforming to the established systems. It was about pushing boundaries, forcing people to look at the world differently, and awakening them to the possibilities of what could be. Then, the group from the video reached out again. This time, they were more direct. Elijah received a package delivered to his doorstep. Inside was a letter that read, "Elijah, we believe in your work, and we see what you're creating. You are not just an artist. You are a leader. The time for change is now. The art world will be yours if you choose it, but we ask you to think about your message and your legacy. What kind of world do you want to create? You can be a part of the system, or you can create a new one." The words were powerful, and they echoed in his mind long after he put the letter down. There was no mention of contracts or deals, no promises of financial support. It was clear that this group wanted Elijah to choose a path that transcended art itself. This was about culture. This was about history. This was about shaping the future in a way that was entirely his own. But Richard's offer wasn't something he could ignore. The financial backing, the network of influential collectors, the stability he could offer, it was everything any artist would dream of. And yet, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Richard was offering him a place at the table, but the table itself was built on old foundations. The traditional art world had been built to exclude voices like Elijah's, voices that challenged the status quo. The truth was, Richard's world was not one of freedom. It was a world of control, of limiting what could be said and done with art, shaping it into something safe, something easily consumed by the elite. It was a world of profit, not change. Elijah's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing. It was a message from Carla, his assistant. Her message was short but direct. Elijah, Richard wants to meet with you tomorrow. He's pulling out all the stops for this one. You need to decide soon. The weight of the decision was now heavier than ever. The meeting with Richard would be the moment of truth. It would be his chance to hear the terms of the deal, to understand exactly what he was being offered. But no matter how tempting the offer seemed, Elijah couldn't forget the words of the anonymous group. He stepped away from his easel and moved to the window, looking out over the city. His mind was in turmoil, but one thing was certain, he could no longer just be an artist. He had become a symbol for something larger. A voice for change. A force for a future where creativity could break free from the chains of tradition. That night, as he lay in bed, unable to sleep, Elijah thought about his father. His father had been an artist too, but in a different way. He had worked as a sculptor in the city's poorest neighborhoods, creating pieces that were meant to reflect the community's struggles and triumphs. He had never been famous, never sought recognition, but his work had touched people's hearts in ways that money could never measure. Elijah had inherited that same passion, but his canvas was bigger. His art wasn't just about telling stories of the past, it was about shaping the future. He could already see the outlines of a new world in his mind, a world where art was not just for the rich and powerful, but for everyone. A world where creativity was a force that united, that inspired, that drove humanity forward. And yet, as the time for his meeting with Richard drew closer, Elijah felt the pull of the traditional art world. It promised him stability, recognition, and an opportunity to reach the highest echelons of success. But he could not ignore the call of the movement, the one that wanted him to be more than just another star in the gallery system. It was a call to change the very system that had rejected him in the first place. The morning of the meeting arrived, and Elijah stood at the threshold of his studio, staring at the door. On the other side of that door was Richard Alverstone, waiting for him to decide. Would he enter the world of established power and influence, or would he follow the path that called for something greater? The time had come to make his choice. Elijah took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He knew what he had to do. With a final glance at his work, he grabbed his jacket and walked out the door. Today would be the day that would define his future, his real future. Elijah's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as he walked toward the meeting room. The weight of the decision he was about to make hung heavy on his shoulders. Every part of him wanted to believe that the right choice would come naturally, but he knew the truth, this was no ordinary decision. This was about his life's work, his legacy, and the very future of his art. Richard Alverstone's office was a gleaming, modern space, sleek, minimalist, and cold. The glass walls looked out over the city, the skyline a testament to the wealth and power of those who inhabited it. It was a room that spoke volumes about Richard's world, a world of control, of refinement, of exclusivity. Elijah stepped inside, his eyes momentarily adjusting to the bright, sterile lights. Richard was sitting behind a large desk, his posture erect, his expression inscrutable. But there was something different in his eyes today, an urgency that hadn't been there before. "Ah, Elijah," Richard said, standing to shake his hand. "Thank you for coming. I know you've been busy, but this is important. I want to offer you something truly extraordinary." Elijah nodded, his gaze unwavering. He had come this far, and now there was no turning back. "I'm listening." Richard gestured for Elijah to take a seat. As he did, the gallery owner's voice softened, becoming almost soothing. "You're an extraordinary artist, Elijah. Your work has captured the world's attention in a way that very few people ever achieve. And I've been following your rise closely. I know the kind of power you wield with your art, and I respect that." Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly. This was the language of manipulation, the softening before the offer. Richard was doing what he did best, flattering his way into the heart of the conversation. Elijah wasn't fooled. He had seen this before, with other artists, other offers. It was always the same. He knew what was coming next. I'm offering you a partnership, Richard continued, his tone growing more persuasive. A place in my gallery, where your work will be showcased at the highest level. Exclusive exhibitions. Access to top-tier collectors. A team of professionals dedicated to your success. This is the kind of opportunity that will elevate your career beyond anything you've imagined. Elijah listened carefully, weighing every word. It was a tempting offer. A chance to have his work seen by the most influential people in the world, to secure his place in art history. It was everything Richard had promised in their previous conversations, only now it seemed more urgent, more final. But Elijah knew what lay behind the polished veneer of Richard's offer. It was a system, a structure designed to control, to dictate what could and couldn't be shown, sold, or appreciated. Richard's gallery, no matter how prestigious, was still part of that same establishment that had rejected him in the past. It was a world of exclusivity and boundaries, a world that Elijah was determined to break free from. I appreciate your offer, Richard, Elijah said carefully, choosing his words with precision. But I'm not looking for an exclusive deal with anyone. What I'm creating isn't just for a select few. My art is for everyone. Richard's smile faltered, just for a moment, before returning with practiced ease. Everyone, he repeated, as though testing the word on his tongue. Elijah, you've built a following. You've gained recognition. But let's be real here, being part of my gallery will give you access to a level of visibility and respect that you can't get by working outside the system. Richard leaned forward, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. I'm offering you a seat at the table. The art world is a business, Elijah. It's not just about painting. It's about positioning, strategy. Do you really want to be left out of that? Do you want to be an outsider forever? The words stung, but Elijah held his ground. This was Richard's world, not his. And Elijah wasn't here to join that world. He was here to build something new. I don't need a seat at the table, Elijah said firmly, his voice calm but resolute. What I'm creating is bigger than that. It's a movement. It's about breaking free from the system. It's about art being for the people, for everyone, not just the elite. Richard's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the facade slipped. He had underestimated Elijah. He had thought the young artist would be swayed by the promise of fame and fortune. He hadn't expected resistance. You're making a mistake, Richard said, his voice hardening. You think you can do this without us? Without the structure? You're naive. The art world doesn't work that way. You can't just be a rebel and expect the world to change around you. It doesn't happen that way. You'll burn out. You'll become irrelevant. Elijah stood up, his decision made. I'm not interested in becoming another cog in your machine, Richard. I'll build my own system. And if I fail, at least I'll have done it on my own terms. Richard's face twisted into a look of disbelief, but there was also something else, something like a grudging respect. Fine. But mark my words, Elijah. You can't fight the system forever. It will crush you. With those final words, Richard stood and extended his hand. I wish you the best of luck, Elijah. But you'll see. The art world is about more than just your talent. It's about influence. And you don't have that, at least, not yet. Elijah didn't take his hand. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door. He knew Richard's words were meant to shake him, to make him doubt. But there was no doubt in his mind. He was on the right path. And he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As he stepped out of the office and into the bright city sunlight, a sense of clarity washed over him. This was no longer just about art. It was about changing the world. Elijah wasn't interested in being part of the system. He was here to dismantle it. And as the world continued to turn, one thing was certain, Elijah Washington was no longer just a young artist. He was a force to be reckoned with. A leader. A visionary. The future was his to shape. Elijah left Richard Alverstone's gallery with the weight of the world on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of freedom. It wasn't the freedom that came with wealth or status, he had already turned down those offers. It was the freedom of knowing that he had made the right choice, even if the world around him couldn't see it yet. The next few weeks were a blur of planning, outreach, and building the foundation for his new vision. Elijah had long understood that art was not just about the brushstrokes on a canvas, it was about connecting people, igniting a fire within them, and sparking change. He was no longer just an artist, he had become a cultural force. A leader. His decision to turn down Richard Alverstone's offer had set him on a path that few in the art world would understand, but Elijah wasn't concerned with their approval. The world was changing, and he was determined to be at the center of that change. It started small. Elijah reached out to a few fellow artists he trusted, those who shared his vision, those who had long fought against the suffocating grip of the traditional art world. He also connected with activists, social media influencers, and visionaries in other fields. This wasn't just about art, it was about a movement that could reshape society itself. It was about disrupting the systems that had held people back for too long. One evening, as Elijah sat in his studio, surrounded by sketches and canvases, he received a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was familiar, but not one he had expected to hear again. "Elijah," the voice said, "this is Amber. I'm with the group you saw in the video. We've been watching you. And now, we need you to lead." It was the same group who had reached out to him anonymously weeks earlier. The global network that had seen in him something that no one else had. They were offering him their full support, financial backing, resources, and the most important thing of all, a platform to amplify his message to the world. "Amber," Elijah replied, his voice steady but filled with a sense of purpose, "I'm ready." And with that, the revolution began. The group had already been laying the groundwork for something big, an underground movement that had been slowly gaining momentum in cities around the world. They were a coalition of artists, activists, and entrepreneurs who wanted to tear down the walls that kept art confined to the elite. They had a vision, to bring art into the streets, into the lives of everyday people, and make it a part of the global conversation. They wanted to build a new world, one where art wasn't a commodity but a means of expression, connection, and transformation. It wasn't long before Elijah's art was everywhere, on billboards, in public spaces, projected onto the sides of buildings. His pieces were no longer just hanging in galleries, they were part of the fabric of the world. "City of Tomorrow" appeared on the walls of subway stations in New York and London, while "Heritage of the Stars" was featured as part of a protest mural in Cairo. His art had become a symbol of hope, of change, of a future where anything was possible. At the same time, the movement that had formed around Elijah began to gain strength. Artists, musicians, writers, and everyday people rallied behind the cause. They shared his message on social media, organized events, and created art that reflected their desire for a new world. The revolution was growing, and it was more than just about art, it was about rewriting the very rules of the game. The media began to take notice. The art world, once so dismissive of Elijah's work, now found itself struggling to keep up with the overwhelming wave of support for him. Interviews flooded in, and reporters began to ask the question that had once been unthinkable: what was the future of art in a world where it belonged to everyone? Elijah's response was always the same: art is not just for the wealthy or the powerful. It's for everyone. It's a tool for change, for expression, for connection. And that's the future I'm creating. But the establishment wasn't going to sit idly by as the world shifted beneath its feet. Richard Alverstone, bruised by Elijah's rejection, watched from the sidelines as his once unchallenged grip on the art world began to slip. He had lost a major player, but more importantly, he had lost control. And that, to him, was unforgivable. Richard's retaliation came swiftly. His gallery launched a smear campaign against Elijah, trying to paint him as an idealistic dreamer who didn't understand the realities of the art world. He brought in powerful allies, critics, curators, and even some former artists, to publicly denounce Elijah's movement as naive and unsustainable. They claimed that the push for a revolution in the art world would only lead to chaos and a decline in quality. But despite their best efforts, Richard's campaign backfired. The more they attacked Elijah, the more his movement gained strength. People were tired of the old systems, tired of the gatekeepers who decided what was art and who was worthy of recognition. They were ready for change, and Elijah's vision was the spark they needed. As the months passed, the movement became unstoppable. What started as a small, underground collective had transformed into a global force, and Elijah's art was at the center of it all. His canvases, murals, and digital projections reached millions, and his name became synonymous with the fight for a new world. Elijah stood at the front of a rally one evening, the crowd before him buzzing with excitement. People from all walks of life, artists, activists, students, and professionals, had gathered to hear him speak. As he took the microphone, the energy in the air was palpable. It was more than just a protest, it was a celebration. It was the dawn of a new era. Art is power, Elijah said, his voice ringing with conviction. It has the power to change minds, to open hearts, to build a future we've never dreamed of. And we, the people, are the ones who will shape that future. The crowd erupted into applause, and in that moment, Elijah knew he had made the right choice. He wasn't just creating art anymore. He was creating a movement, a revolution that would reshape the world, one brushstroke at a time. And as the future stretched out before him, filled with endless possibilities, Elijah knew that this was only the beginning. The revolution had begun, and nothing would stop it now.